they gave command to the man with the silver eagles on his collar. He gave them protocol and procedure. When the rocks began to scream and the darkness came from below, they gave command to the quiet woman who listened to the stone. She gave them silence and victory. They called her a geologist, a civilian contractor, a ghost in the machine. But the Admiral, when he finally broke through the static, called her by her true name, and that name was a weapon that ended a war before it began. The silence in Geode Station was a manufactured thing, a composite of a dozen different sounds layered so precisely they canceled each other out into a low, resonant hum. It was the sound of 200 souls breathing recycled air 3 kilometers beneath the fractured crust of Triton Minor. Dr. Eris Thorne felt it not as an absence of noise, but as a constant, subtle pressure against her eardrums. It was the sound of a tomb pretending to be a sanctuary. The air tasted of ozone and chilled metal, a sterile flavor that clung to the back of the throat. The light was a pale, unblinking blue, emitted from crystalline panels in the ceiling, a light designed to mimic a sky this deep outpost would never see. It was a light that offered illumination, but no warmth, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of every corridor. The station was a knife blade of technology driven deep into the heart of a hostile moon, and its sterile environment was a constant, unspoken declaration of war against the wilderness outside. Eris sat before her console in the geo-monitoring alcove, a space no larger than a closet, tucked away from the command center's primary traffic lanes. The polished chrome and blue light of the station seemed to stop at the threshold of her domain. Here, the only light came from the warm amber glow of her holographic displays. They swam around her in a slow, hypnotic ballet of data, cascading seismic waveforms, topographical maps rendered in 3 dimensions, spectral analyses of core samples, and gravimetric distortion charts. To others, it was a meaningless storm of numbers and light. To Aris, it was a language. She was not reading data. She was listening to the slow, deep voice of the moon itself. For 6 months, she had done nothing but listen. She listened to the groaning of tectonic plates, the whisper of subterranean cryomagma flows, and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the gas giant, Neptune, whose immense gravity squeezed and kneaded its tiny moon like a ball of clay. Her fingers moved with quiet, economical grace over the console's surface, not typing, but conducting. She isolated a micro-tremor, a faint shudder that had registered at a depth of 30 kilometers. It was patternless, an anomaly. Standard analysis would have dismissed it as sensor noise, a ghost in the machine. But Eris did not believe in ghosts, only in phenomena not yet understood. She cross-referenced the tremor with the station's own vibrational output, the thrum of the life support systems, the deep, resonant pulse of the geothermal drill that powered them all, the faint echo of footfalls in the corridors. She subtracted it all, filtering out the station's own heartbeat until only the alien signature remained. It was faint, a whisper beneath a roar, but it was there. And it was repeating. It was a signal disguised as geological noise, a signature hiding in the one place a military outpost would never look, the very ground on which it was built. Her appearance was as quiet as her work. She wore simple gray station fatigues, devoid of rank or insignia. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There was nothing about her that demanded attention. Her face, pale in the amber light, was a study in placid concentration. Her eyes, the color of a winter storm, missed nothing. She was an observer, a node in a network of information. and she had cultivated an unassuming presence that allowed her to see without being seen. She was cataloged in the station's personnel manifest as a civilian contractor, a specialist brought in to monitor tectonic stability. It was a plausible and profoundly boring cover that ensured no one ever bothered her. No one except the man who now stood silhouetted at the entrance to her alcove, his presence a discordant clang in the quiet symphony of her work. Commander Valerius was a man carved from granite and regulation. His uniform was so sharply creased, it looked like it could cut. The silver eagles on his collar seemed to glitter with a cold, proprietary light. He was the commander of Geode Station's security detachment, and he moved through its corridors as if he had personally bolted them together. His face was a mask of stern competence, but Aris saw the subtle tells of a deeper insecurity. The way his jaw tightened when he was questioned, the way his eyes flicked from side to side, constantly assessing his audience, not the situation. He was a man who performed authority rather than possessed it. His voice, when he spoke, was a blunt instrument. "Dr. Thorne," he said, the title layered with a subtle condescension. "Another day spent staring at your rocks?" Aris did not turn. Her eyes remained on the holographic display, where the anomalous waveform was now resolving into a clearer, more disturbing pattern. It was a complex, non-repeating sequence, but it had an underlying mathematical structure. It was artificial. "The rocks are speaking, Commander," she replied, her voice soft, yet carrying a strange resonance in the small space. It would be rude not to listen. Valerius stepped fully into the alcove, his bulk seeming to diminish the space, his presence sucking the air from it. He gestured dismissively at the swirling data. "And what are they saying? Are they complaining about the new drilling schedule? This station has been stable for 5 years. Your work is a budgetary redundancy, a box-ticking exercise to placate some geology subcommittee back on Earth." He saw her as a civilian, an academic, an unnecessary variable in his tightly controlled military equation. Her silence, her focus, her utter lack of deference to his rank, it was a constant irritant. She finally turned her head, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were calm, analytical, and held no trace of the intimidation he was used to inspiring. "They are saying that something is down there with us," she stated simply. "Something that is also listening." She swiped a hand through the air, and the primary display zoomed in on the signal. "This is not a natural phenomenon. It is a carrier wave, masked by stochastic geological noise. It is directional, and it is probing the station's foundations." Valerius stared at the flickering lines for a moment, his expression a mixture of scorn and confusion. He understood shields, phaser arrays, and troop deployments. He did not understand seismic resonance. To him, this was academic nonsense. "A carrier wave? Doctor, we have the most sophisticated sensor suite in this quadrant. If a flea coughed in orbit, my tactical officer would know what it had for breakfast. Nothing has breached our perimeter. Nothing." His certainty was absolute, a wall built of protocol and pride. "It did not need to breach the perimeter," Aris said, her voice remaining level, a clinical statement of fact. "It was here long before we were. It is using the moon's lithosphere as a transmission medium. It is bypassing your sensors entirely because your sensors are pointed up at the sky. You are guarding the front door while something is mapping the basement." She turned back to her console, her attention already consumed by the problem. The signal had just changed its modulation frequency, a direct response to the station's geothermal drill cycling up. It was learning. The conversation, for her, was over. The commander's face flushed a dull red. Her dismissal was more infuriating than any direct challenge. He was a commander of men, a bastion of military order, and this quiet, unassuming woman was treating him like a student. "I will have your report on my desk by 0800, he snapped, his voice tight. "And it will be written in plain language, Doctor. No more fantasies about talking rocks." He turned and stalked away, his heavy boots striking the deck plating with angry, percussive reports. The sound was a crude intrusion, and Aris methodically filtered it out of her acoustic analysis, dismissing him as just another source of ambient, irrelevant noise. She watched the waveform on her screen. It pulsed again, a soft, insidious rhythm. A question asked in the language of physics, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that an answer was coming. The morning briefing was a ritual of command, and Commander Valerius conducted it like a high priest. He stood before the main holo table in the command center, a vast circular room known as the core. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of a dozen officers and technicians at their stations. A three-dimensional map of the surrounding space dominated the center of the room, showing patrol routes, sensor grids, and the slow, majestic orbit of Neptune. Valerius thrived in this environment. It was a theater, and he was its lead actor. His reports were crisp, his orders decisive. He spoke of readiness, of vigilance, of the unassailable security of Geode Station. Aris stood at the back of the room, near the entrance to her alcove, an observer by nature and by choice. She had been summoned by a direct order from Valerius, a petty exercise of his authority. He wanted an audience for her public dismissal. She held a data slate in one hand, containing the report he had demanded. It was concise, technical, and utterly damning. It detailed the artificial nature of the seismic signals, their interactive behavior, and the calculated probability of a subsurface threat at 97.3%. It concluded with a recommendation to immediately suspend geothermal drilling and reroute primary power to inertial dampeners, a counterintuitive measure she knew he would never comprehend. "And finally," Valerius said, his voice ringing with theatrical finality, "we have the report from our civilian geological consultant." He turned his head and pinned Aris with a look of condescending amusement. The other officers turned as well, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disinterest. "Dr. Thorne has some creative theories about our moon's interior life. Doctor, please, enlighten us." The invitation was a trap designed to make her look foolish. Aris walked forward, her steps silent on the deck. She did not look at the faces of the officers. She did not look at Valerius. She looked at the holo table, at the intricate glowing model of Geode Station suspended within the larger model of Triton Minor. Her gaze was focused on the thin, fragile line that separated the station from the 3,000 kilometers of rock and ice below it. "Commander," she began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the low hum of the core. "My report is not a theory. It is a data-driven analysis. An unidentified, intelligent source is using the planet's tectonic structure as a communications and reconnaissance network. The signals are adaptive. They are currently focused on the resonant frequency of the station's primary supports and the geothermal conduit." A low murmur rippled through the assembled officers. The tactical officer, a young lieutenant named Rostova, leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was sharp, and Aris had noted her before. Rostova understood data. Valerius, however, saw only a challenge to his authority. He laughed, a short barking sound that was entirely without humor. An intelligent source? Doctor, are you suggesting we have mole men? Space gophers? You are wasting the time of my senior staff with science fiction. I am suggesting, Eris countered, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the room's attention with its quiet intensity, that you have a fundamental misunderstanding of your environment. You perceive this station as a fortress. In reality, it is a bell, and something is down there, tapping it, listening to the sound it makes, learning its exact shape and composition. It is looking for the precise frequency that will shatter it. She placed her data slate on the edge of the holotable. It is all in the report. The mathematics are undeniable. Valerius picked up the slate, holding it as if it were contaminated. He glanced at the first page, his eyes scanning the dense equations and spectral charts. His expression tightened. He did not understand it, and that made him furious. He was a man of action, of clear targets and simpler physics. This was abstract, insidious. Undeniable? What is undeniable, Doctor, is that I am the commander of this facility. My sensors, my patrols, and my tactical assessments show zero threats. Your data is an anomaly, a sensor ghost. Your recommendation to shut down our primary power source based on this fantasy is not just absurd, it is borderline seditious. He tossed the slate back onto the table. It slid across the smooth surface and came to rest inches from her hand. The gesture was one of utter contempt. The room was silent. The other officers looked away, embarrassed or intimidated. Only Lieutenant Rostova continued to watch, her eyes flicking from Valerius to Eris, a silent calculation running behind her gaze. Valerius crossed his arms, assuming a posture of unassailable authority. Your contract with Sector Command is for geological stability analysis. You have found no instability. Therefore, your function here is complete. I am officially terminating your advisory role on this station. You will confine yourself to your quarters until transport can be arranged. Is that understood? This was the moment, the public humiliation, the reassertion of the hierarchy. Eris met his gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through her calm expression. It was not anger, not fear. It was a profound, almost clinical pity. You are making a mistake, Commander, she said, her voice a flat statement of fact. The only mistake, Valerius shot back, his voice rising, was allowing a civilian academic to distract my command with ghost stories. Your opinion is no longer required. Now, leave the Corps. His authority, in his mind, was absolute. The challenge had been met and crushed. He had restored order. Eris did not move. She simply stood there, a silent, unmoving rebuke to his power. The tension in the room became a physical thing, thick and suffocating. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Valerius's face darkened with rage. He was about to order her physically removed. Then, the station screamed. It was not a sound. It was a feeling, a deep, violent shudder that came from the rock beneath their feet, a resonant vibration that passed through the deck plates and into the very bones of everyone in the Corps. It was a pure, harmonic note of immense power, and it felt like the moon itself was trying to tear the station apart. Red lights flashed across the control panels, and a synthesized voice, unnervingly calm, began to chant a litany of disaster. Warning: structural integrity failure in sectors Gamma and Delta. Inertial dampeners offline. Atmospheric seals compromised on decks 7 through 9. The holotable flickered, the serene map of space replaced by a frantic, flashing schematic of Geode Station. Entire sections were blinking red. The vibration intensified, a low, gut-wrenching hum that made the teeth ache. People stumbled, grabbing onto consoles for support. The manufactured silence of the station was gone, replaced by the shriek of tearing metal and the rising chorus of alarms. The crisis was not an attack from the void, it was a tectonic assault from below. Commander Valerius was thrown off balance, his face a mask of disbelief and shock. His world of order and protocol had been shattered in an instant, but his training kicked in, a rigid set of reflexes that overrode his fear. "Red alert!" he roared, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony. "Damage control teams to all affected sectors. Seal the bulkheads. Bring main shields to full power. Get me a tactical display of the exterior. Find me a target." His orders were the textbook response to an external attack. They were precise, loud, and utterly wrong. "Shields at full, sir," a technician yelled back, his hands flying across his console. On the main view screen, the star field outside was replaced by the shimmering, hexagonal pattern of the station's energy shields. The vibration grew worse. A high-pitched whine began to build, the sound of unimaginable stress on the station's superstructure. "Sir, the resonance is amplifying," shouted Lieutenant Rostova from her post. "The shields are acting like a focusing lens for the seismic energy. They're concentrating it." Valerius stared, uncomprehending. "That's impossible. Shields block energy," he bellowed, his worldview crumbling around him. He was trying to fight a ship, but he was being attacked by a planet. His methods, the ones that had been drilled into him for 20 years, were not just ineffective. They were actively making the situation worse. The fortress was becoming a tomb. He ordered countermeasures launched, torpedoes and phaser arrays firing blindly into the rock below, a futile gesture of brute force against a problem of physics. The explosions were swallowed by the moon's mass, their energy adding to the chaos. Panic began to set in. Officers shouted contradictory reports. Systems were failing in a cascading domino effect. The station's own power source, the geothermal drill, was now the conduit for its destruction, feeding the hostile resonance directly into its heart. The lights flickered, threatening to plunge them into darkness. The great machine of the military, so powerful in certain moments before, had seized up. Its commander was frozen, his mind unable to process a threat that did not appear on his tactical screens, a threat that had no ship, no weapon signatures, no face. He was staring at the tactical display, searching for an enemy to shoot, while the real enemy was the ground beneath his feet. The failure of orthodoxy was total. He was a master of a game that was no longer being played. In the center of the chaos, Eris Thorne stood perfectly still. The violent shuddering of the deck seemed not to affect her. Her body moved with the vibration, absorbing it, understanding it. While others were deafened by the noise, she was listening. She could feel the resonant frequency as a physical presence in the room. She could map its peaks and troughs, its harmonic intervals. It was a weapon of elegant, brutal simplicity. It was not designed to blast the station apart, but to shake it to pieces, to find the single, perfect note that would turn its advanced alloys to dust. Her earlier analysis had been correct in every detail. She felt no satisfaction in this, only a cold, pressing urgency. The time for warnings was over. The lights flickered again, died, and then came back on under emergency power, casting the core in a hellish red glow. The main view screen was a mess of static. The command center was a landscape of fear and confusion. Valerius was shouting, but no one was listening anymore. Authority had evaporated in the face of annihilation. All eyes, one by one, began to turn toward the one person in the room who was not panicking. The quiet woman who had told them this was coming. Eris Thorne stepped forward, her movement calm and deliberate. She walked to the tactical station manned by Lieutenant Rostova, who looked up, her face pale, but her eyes sharp and focused. "The commander's orders are making it worse," Rostova said, her voice tight but steady. She had seen the truth in the data. "Yes," Eris replied, her voice cutting through the din with effortless clarity. "He is trying to armor a bell against its own ringing." She placed her hand on the console next to Rostova's. Her touch was light, yet it seemed to ground the frantic energy of the station. "The enemy is using a resonant feedback loop. Our shield harmonics, the drill's frequency, the station's own structural resonance. They are tuning them, amplifying them. We cannot block it. We have to break the feedback." Commander Valerius finally saw her. His face, slick with sweat in the red light, was a canvas of fury and desperation. "Thorne, I gave you an order. Get back to your orders are destroying this station, Commander," Eris interrupted, her voice devoid of emotion. It was not an insult. It was a diagnosis. She turned to Rostova, ignoring Valerius completely. The shift in the room's power dynamic was a palpable thing, a magnetic field realigning itself. Authority was no longer a matter of rank. It was flowing toward the only source of competence. "Lieutenant, I need access to the geothermal drill's primary control, and I need you to drop the shields." The order was so counterintuitive, it bordered on madness. "Drop the shields?" Valerius sputtered, incredulous. "That's suicide." "Keeping them up is suicide," Eris countered, without looking at him. Her focus was entirely on Rostova. "The shields are the amplifier. The drill is the conduit. We are going to use the conduit to transmit a counter frequency. We are not going to block the wave. We are going to cancel it." She looked at Rostova, her gaze intense and direct. "It is a problem of destructive interference. Can you give me control?" Rostova stared at her for a long second. On one side was her commanding officer, a man of rank and tradition, yelling orders that were clearly failing. On the other was a civilian specialist, a quiet woman who had predicted this exact disaster, offering a solution that defied all military doctrine, but was rooted in a logic that Rostova, a data analyst at heart, could understand. It was a choice between following protocol into oblivion or following logic into the unknown. She made her choice. "Yes, doctor," she said, her fingers already flying across her console. "Rerouting primary drill control to your station. Stand by." "Lieutenant, you are relieved of duty," Valerius roared, taking a step toward her. "Security, arrest this woman. Arrest them both." But no one moved. The security officers stood frozen, their eyes on Eris. The rest of the bridge crew was watching her, their faces filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope. Valerius's authority was gone. It had been a hollow shell, and the crisis had shattered it. He was just a loud, frightened man in a room full of people who wanted to live. Rostova didn't even flinch. "Shields are down, Doctor," she announced, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. As the shimmering energy field collapsed, the station gave a violent lurch, as if a great pressure had been released. The high-pitched whining sound ceased, but the deep, bone-jarring vibration remained. "Control is yours," Rostova said, pushing a portable holographic interface toward Aris. Aris took the device. A complex three-dimensional model of the geothermal drill and the surrounding lithosphere sprang to life in her hands. She did not hesitate. Her mind was already a dozen steps ahead, calculating the precise phase shifts and amplitude modulations required. She was no longer a geologist. She was a weapon systems officer, and her weapon was a 3-kilometer-long mining laser pointed at the heart of a moon. "We have one shot at this," she said, her voice a low, calm murmur. "The counter wave must be perfect. A single miscalculation in the phase timing, and we will amplify the resonance, not cancel it. We'll tear the station apart ourselves." Her fingers began to move, a blur of motion as she input a series of complex commands. It was not the brute force hammering of a military officer. It was the delicate, precise work of a surgeon or a concert pianist. She was tuning the planet. The geothermal drill, an instrument of power generation, was now an instrument of war. Under Eris's command, it began to change its function. The deep, steady pulse that powered the station faltered, replaced by a complex staccato rhythm. Deep in the moon's mantle, the drill's emitter head, a massive assembly of focusing crystals and magnetic coils, began to pulse, not with raw power, but with a carefully shaped wave of energy. It was a mirror image of the attacker's frequency, perfectly out of phase. Eris watched the seismic data feedback, her eyes tracking the convergence of the two opposing waves. The station was the epicenter, the point where two invisible, titanic forces were about to meet. "It is not a battle," she murmured, almost to herself, her eyes locked on the swirling amber data. "It is a conversation. They asked a question in the language of resonance. We are about to give them the answer." The answer was a single, definitive word: no. She made a final, minute adjustment to the amplitude, a flick of her finger that altered the energy output by a fraction of a percent. The calculation was complete. The solution was locked in. She looked at Rostova, whose face was illuminated by the glow of the data, her expression one of utter awe. "Now," Eris said. Rostova nodded and slammed her hand down on her console. "Executing!" Deep below them, the geothermal drill fired. It was not a blast, but a release. A single, perfectly formed pulse of seismic energy, a pure note of physics, raced outward through the rock. On the main display, Eris had isolated the two waveforms. One was the angry, jagged red line of the attack. The other was the cool, precise blue line of their response. For a moment, they raced toward each other like two opposing armies. Then they met. There was no sound. There was no explosion. There was only an instantaneous, profound, and absolute silence. The vibration ceased. The shuddering of the deck plates stopped. The shriek of stressed metal was gone. The red alert lights blinked out one by one. The emergency lighting was replaced by the cool, steady blue of the station's normal operational state. The two waveforms on Eris's screen had touched, and in that instant they had both vanished, annihilating each other in a perfect act of destructive interference. It was the physical embodiment of a double negative, a flawless cancellation. The attack was not repelled. It was erased from existence. A collective breath was released in the core. The silence that followed was deeper and more complete than the manufactured hum that had preceded it. It was the silence of survival, of disbelief, of salvation. People looked at each other, their faces stunned. They looked at their consoles, which now showed green lights across the board. They looked at the unassuming woman in the gray fatigues, who stood as still and calm as a statue in the center of the room. She had not shouted. She had not fought. She had thought. And in thinking, she had defeated a foe that all of their weapons and all of their protocols could not even comprehend. Commander Valerius stood frozen, his face a ruin of shattered pride and raw confusion. He stared at Aris, his mouth slightly agape. The entire event, from the first tremor to the final, deafening silence, had taken less than 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, his entire world, his career, his understanding of warfare had been dismantled. He had been proven not just wrong, but irrelevant. He was a relic, a blunt instrument in an age that required scalpels. His authority had not just been challenged, it had been rendered obsolete. Eris lowered the holographic interface. The light from it died, and she was once again just a quiet woman in the blue glow of the command center. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Lieutenant Rostova, a quiet acknowledgement of a job well done. Rostova, for her part, simply stared back, her expression one of veneration. She had not just witnessed competence, she had witnessed mastery on a level she had not known existed. Then a new sound broke the silence, a soft, chiming tone from the long-range communications console. A technician, his movement slow and tentative, as if waking from a dream, touched his controls. "Commander, sir," he stammered, his eyes wide. "I have an incoming Priority 1 channel. It's Fleet Command. It's Admiral Jorik." The name fell into the silent room with the weight of legend. Admiral Jorik was the supreme commander of the sector, a man spoken of in whispers, a strategic genius who had not been seen on the front lines in a decade. Valerius snapped back to some semblance of his former self. This was a chance, a lifeline. He could report, take control of the narrative, salvage something from the wreckage of his command. He strode toward the comm station, straightening his uniform by reflex. "Put him on the main screen," he commanded, his voice raspy but firm. "I'll take it." The main view screen, which moments before had been a wall of static, cleared. The face that appeared was old, lined with the stress of 1,000 campaigns, but the eyes were as sharp and clear as fractured ice. Admiral Jorik did not look pleased. His gaze swept across the core, taking in the scene with a swift, comprehensive glance. He saw the relieved but stunned faces of the crew. He saw the still smoldering damage on a far bulkhead, and he saw Commander Valerius stepping forward to address him. "Admiral Jorik, sir," Valerius began, his voice straining for a note of command composure. "Commander Valerius reporting. We experienced an unexpected geological event, but the situation is now under control. I am not interested in your situation report, Commander." Jorik's voice boomed from the speakers, a voice like grinding stones, cold and heavy with impatience. It cut Valerius off mid-sentence, the rebuke so sharp and sudden it was like a physical blow. Valerius flinched. The Admiral's icy gaze swept past him, searching. "My intelligence annex registered a phase-conjugated seismic event on this rock, an attack signature I have not seen in 20 years. They also registered a perfectly modulated counterwave that neutralized it. That is not the work of a station commander who is controlling a situation. That is the work of an artist. So, I will ask you once, Commander, who is in command of Geode Station?" Valerius was dumbstruck. The question was an accusation. It implied that he, the decorated commander, was not the one responsible for their salvation. He swallowed hard, his pride warring with the cold, undeniable truth. "Sir, I am the commander of this station." My crew responded. "No," Jorik said, the word final, absolute. "You are not. You are a functionary. I want to speak to the person who is actually in charge. I want to speak to Red Venom. The name descended into the silent room. Red Venom. It was not a call sign, it was a myth, a ghost story told by veteran intelligence officers, a legend from the dark, forgotten battles of the Outer Rim War. Red Venom was not a person, but a concept, a strategic asset so secret, so effective, that their existence was officially denied. A mind that could weaponize anything, a star's magnetic field, a planet's orbit, a moon's geology. To hear the name spoken aloud by Admiral Jorik himself was like hearing a god invoke a demon. Every head in the room turned, not to the commander, not to the tactical officers, but to the quiet, unassuming woman in the gray fatigues. They turned to Dr. Eris Thorne. She stood, unmoved, as the weight of 200 stares fell upon her. The pieces began to click into place in everyone's mind. Her strange calm, her impossible knowledge, her quiet, absolute confidence. The geologist was a mask. The civilian contractor was a lie. Valerius stared at her, his face a pale mask of horror and dawning comprehension. He saw her not as the irritating academic anymore, but as something else entirely, something far above his comprehension or his authority. He remembered his own words, his dismissals, his threats. He had tried to have a legend arrested. He had called a myth borderline seditious. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear he had felt during the attack, washed over him. "By what authority?" he whispered, the words catching in his throat, a final, pathetic grasp at the hierarchical world he understood. He was not speaking to her, but to the universe that had suddenly turned upside down. Eris looked at him. For the second time, that flicker of pity crossed her features. A faint, sad smile touched her lips, a ghost of an expression. She gestured with her chin toward the giant, imposing face on the view screen. "Ask the Admiral," she said softly. Then she walked to the comm station, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who knew, with absolute certainty, her place in the universe. She stood before the screen, meeting the Admiral's hard gaze with her own calm one. "Admiral," she said, her voice the same quiet, level tone she had used all along. "The initial probe has been neutralized, but they know we are here now, and they have learned the station's fundamental frequency. They will adapt. This was only the first question." Jorik's harsh expression softened almost imperceptibly. He was not looking at a subordinate, but at an equal, perhaps even a superior in her own unique domain. "I concur, Venom," he replied, the use of the name a formal acknowledgement, a coronation. "What is your assessment?" The exchange was seamless, the conversation of two masters of their craft. They had excluded Valerius, and by extension, the entire formal command structure, as if it were simply not relevant. Valerius stood by, a spectator at his own execution. He had been so proud of the eagles on his collar, but they were just pieces of metal. He was facing a woman whose authority was not granted by rank, but was an intrinsic part of who she was. Her name was the only rank she needed. The Admiral's validation was not a promotion. It was a confirmation of a fact that had been true all along. The quiet professional had been revealed, and the arrogant authority was left with nothing but the dust of his own shattered pride. The reckoning was silent, swift, and absolute. In the hours that followed, a new order settled over Guiode Station. It was not an order dictated by rank insignia or shouted commands, but a quiet, efficient hierarchy based on demonstrated competence. Admiral Jorik's orders had been brief and brutally clear. Commander Valerius was relieved of command, pending a full inquiry. His security credentials were revoked, his command codes nullified. He was confined to his quarters, a commander no longer, just a man waiting for a ship to take him away from the sight of his own irrelevance. He did not protest. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollow, chilling understanding of the forces he had failed to comprehend. He had mistaken the map for the territory, and the territory itself had risen up and swallowed him. Eris Thorn, or Red Venom, as the crew now thought of her, the name a whispered thing of awe and fear, did not assume a formal command role. She had no need for it. Authority had settled on her shoulders as naturally as dust. When she spoke, people listened. When she made a suggestion, it was treated as an order. She moved through the station, overseeing the recalibration of every system, her presence a silent, calming influence in the aftermath of the crisis. She worked with the engineering teams to reinforce the station's structural supports, not with more armor, but by installing a series of tunable harmonic dampeners, turning the station's greatest vulnerability into a defensive system. She showed them how to listen to the rock, how to feel its subtle shifts and pressures, how to make the moon an ally instead of an enemy. She showed no pleasure in her victory, no triumph in Valerius's downfall. His failure was, to her, simply a data point, an expected outcome of a flawed system confronting a complex variable. Ego, pride, tradition, they were noise in the signal, inefficiencies to be filtered out. Her focus remained entirely on the problem. The entity below them was intelligent, patient, and had now been provoked. The first exchange was over, but the war had just begun. Her work was not finished. Late in the station's designated night cycle, Eris was back in her alcove, the amber glow of the holographic displays a familiar comfort. The data streams were different now. She was no longer just a passive listener. She was actively probing the depths, sending out her own quiet questions in the language of seismic waves. She was mapping the enemy, learning its habits, its language, its weaknesses. The alcove was no longer a forgotten closet. It had become the true command center of Geode Station. A figure appeared at the entrance. It was Lieutenant Rostova. She held 2 mugs, steam rising from them in the cool, recycled air. She did not speak at first, simply stood there, watching Eris work. The former barrier of rank and station was gone, replaced by a different kind of distance, the gap between exceptional talent and true genius. Finally, Eris looked up, her eyes acknowledging the lieutenant's presence. Rostova stepped forward and offered one of the mugs. "Nutrient paste," she said. "The replicators are still a bit shaky, but it's warm." It was not an offering from a subordinate to a superior. It was a gesture of simple human respect, a quiet acknowledgement. Eris took the mug, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said. "Ava," Rostova corrected her softly. "My name is Ava." She gestured with her own mug toward the swirling data. "I've been running simulations based on the attack signature, the complexity, the way it adapted to our shield output in real time. It's not like any weapon system I've ever seen. It's more like a biological response, like we're sitting on a living thing." Eris took a slow sip from the mug. The paste was bland, but the warmth was welcome. "That is a logical assumption," she replied. "We define life by a narrow set of parameters, carbon-based, requiring water, existing within a certain temperature range. We look for things that look like us. We have a failure of imagination. The universe does not." She turned her gaze back to the display. "This life speaks in mathematics. It thinks in physics, and it considers us a foreign body, an infection. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting an immune system. Eva stood beside her, watching the waveforms pulse and flow. She was no longer just a tactical officer, she was a student. "How do you fight that?" she asked, her voice low. "How do you win a war against a planet?" "You do not win," Eris said, her eyes tracing a new, faint signal beginning to form in the deep strata. "You negotiate, you learn its language, and you find a way to coexist, or you teach it a new word, the word for fear." The new signal was coalescing, taking shape. The enemy was learning, it was asking another question. Her purpose here was almost fulfilled. The immediate threat was understood, the station's defenses transformed. The crew was now aware, their leadership grounded in reality instead of regulation. She had been the catalyst, the ghost in the machine who appeared only when the system had completely failed. Soon a new commander would arrive, one briefed by Jorik, one who understood the true nature of the post, and she would disappear as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind nothing but a recalibrated station and a legend that would be told for years to come. She would become another ghost story, a tale of the quiet geologist who saved a station by talking to the rocks. She was a force of nature, an intellectual predator, and her natural environment was the silent, brutal clarity of an unsolvable problem. She existed for the crisis, for the moment when all other systems failed. She was not a leader of men, but a master of variables. Her victory was not in the command she held, but in the order she restored, an order based not on the transient authority of rank, but on the eternal authority of a correct solution. She was Red Venom, a name like a weapon, but her true power was not in destruction. It was in understanding. And as she watched the new threat begin to stir in the deep, silent dark, she felt the closest thing to peace she ever knew. She was listening, and the universe was about to speak.